What's up, everybody? This is Alex Christoforou with the Duran, and I have with me Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. And today we're going to be taking a look at the breaking news with the downing of the Il-20 plane over Syria. All right, Alexander, let's get into it because this is breaking news. What's going on with the downing of this plane? We've had a lot of news from Russia, from the Ministry of Defense, from Israel, the IDF. What's going on? Give us your breakdown.
Indeed, this is a huge story, Alex. And can I just say that as we're going online, I'm just receiving reports, I'm seeing reports that Putin and Netanyahu, that's the Prime Minister of Israel, are on the phone to each other. And Netanyahu has apparently told Putin that he's really sorry about what happened. It doesn't seem to be an apology, however. The Israelis are being very defiant about this. Now, what seems to have happened was this. The Israelis carried out an air raid in northwest Syria, not very far from the Russian air base at Hmeimim, which is in northwest Syria. That's the key Russian base where most of the Russian aircraft are based, which carry out raids across Syria, targeting various jihadi factions. This Israeli air raid has been happening at a time when there's been a huge amount of tension because of talk that the Russians were going to back a Syrian army offensive against the jihadi forces in Idlib. So one wonders what this air raid was about, first of all. The Syrian air defense then retaliated against the Israeli aircraft that were carrying out the strike, and the Russian Air Force says that there were 4 of them, 4 F-16 fighter jets of the Israeli Air Force launching missiles against Syria. The Russians say that there was also a French frigate involved in some way, though it's not yet exactly clear what exactly it was doing, but it was there, and it seems that the Israelis and the French were coordinating with each other. Now, that is important because the French have also spoken of launching attacks on Syria in case there was a chemical attack there. So that looks an interesting situation where the Israelis and the French are working together in this kind of context. Now, there was this surveillance aircraft, a Russian military surveillance aircraft, propeller-driven, based on the Il-18, which is an airliner that the Soviet Union developed in the 1950s, but which, like other 1950s aircraft, both in Russia and the US, has been developed into an electronic spy plane. It carries out electronic surveillance. And the Russians were saying that what it was doing was that it was spying on these jihadi groups in the Idlib area who have been launching drone attacks on the Russian air base at Hmeimim. And the Russians say that what happened was when the Syrians launched their missiles against these F-16s, the Israelis dodged the missiles by hiding behind this bigger Russian aeroplane, which then drew the missiles onto itself and therefore got shot down, allowing the Israelis to escape. Now, if this is true, if that is indeed what the Israeli aircraft were doing, then first of all, that is an outrageous step. It is also an extremely dangerous one because it shows that the Israelis were using the Russians as some kind of shield to protect their air force from the increasingly advanced and extremely effective Syrian air defenses. Now, the Russians will be extremely concerned about that. We can be sure that the telephone lines between Moscow and Jerusalem are burning as we are speaking. As we have said, Putin has spoken to Netanyahu. I am sure that Putin has given very strong warnings to Netanyahu not to do this thing again. And I am sure that Netanyahu has given Putin assurances that it will not happen again. Because to be very clear, neither the Russians nor the Israelis want to see a military escalation between them in Syria. The Russians are focused overwhelmingly on getting the Syrian army and the Syrian government in control of Idlib province, and they do not want complications with the Israelis whilst that is carried out. The Israelis, for their part, do not want to add Russia, with its immensely powerful military forces in Syria, to their list of enemies. So we have seen already Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel apologizing, or at least saying sorry to Putin over the phone. And I am sure that discussions will be taking place between the Russians and the Israelis to make sure that this kind of incident doesn't happen again. But I think the Russians will also want explanations about why the Israeli fighters behaved in that fashion, why the Russians were apparently only given a 1-minute warning of this air raid before it was launched. And I suspect that there will be very strong and firm lectures from the Russians to the Israelis, and they're happening now. And I would finish by adding that, of course, just as Putin is speaking to Netanyahu, the Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, is also apparently speaking to the Israeli defense minister, Avigdor Lieberman. Lieberman is a Jewish Russian, so that conversation will be taking place in Russian. Shoigu is a very tough character, and I am sure that he will be expressing himself in very tough and very forceful language in the way that the Russians do when they have to do.
All right. Let's finish this segment because this news is breaking, and we're going to get into more detail in another show that we're going to do, which is related to what's going on in Syria, specifically Putin meeting with Erdogan in Sochi. But for the purposes of this segment, Alexander, so you can finish off your summary as to what's going on, because a lot of news is coming in. You mentioned that there was a 1-minute warning sent to Russia. Go into a little more detail on that, and also answer why did Israel launch this attack in the first place, and how did Putin and Netanyahu de-escalate? So go into the 1-minute aspect that you mentioned. Then I want you to touch upon why Israel launched this attack, and then where does Putin and Netanyahu go from here on out?
Right. The 1-minute warning is in fact in some ways the key to this whole puzzle, because I mean it's the big question, the big unanswered question. Now, when the Russians intervened in Syria in 2015, they invited Netanyahu to Moscow, and there was a discussion, there was a negotiation between the Russians and the Israelis, and between Putin and Netanyahu, in which the Russians said to the Israelis, look, we know that you have a long-standing conflict with Syria. We're not involved in that conflict. We don't want to be involved in that conflict. We're here to fight the jihadi terrorists in Syria. What we propose is that we set up something called a deconfliction hotline, so that we will inform you of where our military aircraft are in Syria, and you will inform us of where your military aircraft are in Syria. And that way, there won't be any cross lines, and that way accidents won't happen. There won't be accidental conflicts in which Russian or Israeli aircraft get shot down by the other side, because they will each know where the other was. Now, 1-minute warning is, to all intents and purposes, an Israeli violation of that agreement, because there is nothing you can do in a minute. I mean, it is inconceivable that you can move large numbers of aircraft or a target zone in a minute, even jet aircraft, never mind propeller aircraft. Now, I think the reason why the Israelis only gave the Russians a 1-minute warning of this raid was because this raid was so close in some of its targets to the Russian airbase at Khmeimim. And the Israelis were concerned that if they informed the Russians that they were going to carry out this raid well in advance, the Russians, who have an extremely advanced air defense system in and around their Khmeimim airbase, would tell the Israelis, nothing doing, you're not going to carry out an air raid so close to our main military base in Syria. And if you do that, please be aware, our air defense system stands ready to intercept your aircraft and to shoot them down. So that's why I think the Israelis only gave a minute's warning. Now, why did the Israelis carry out the air raid then so close to this Russian airbase, taking upon themselves the extraordinary risk that something catastrophically would go wrong, as in fact it did? And of course, there's lots of speculations about this, lots of rumors. Some say this was a provocation to the Russians to try and lead them into a conflict with Israel, which would lead to an attack by the United States on the Russians in Syria, as has been threatened recently. That's one theory. Another theory is that this was a warning to the Russians from the Israelis, which is that the Israelis can do whatever they basically want in Syria. They're not going to pay any attention to what the Russians say, and that this was a way of the Israelis showing that. I don't believe either of those two theories. I think both those theories are wrong. I think that the reason the Israelis carried out that raid is because they are concerned that the Syrian military is using the Russian air defense system in and around the Russian air base to provide arms and weapon systems to groups like Hezbollah and to strengthen its positions around Idlib province. So I think this was not actually targeted at the Russians. I think this was targeted at the Syrian army, at Hezbollah, that's this Lebanese militia that the Israelis are in conflict with, and in Iran. That doesn't change the fact that this was an utterly irresponsible and reckless raid. And I am sure that the Russians are telling the Israelis this, and I'm sure that the Russians are telling the Israelis, never do this thing again. And if you do, there will be serious consequences. And I am sure that the Israelis are heeding that warning.
All right. And real quickly, how does Putin and Netanyahu de-escalate this real quick? How do you see that escalating?
As I said, I think, the way the Russians will do it, first of all, Netanyahu has said that he's very sorry. And I think the Russians will accept that. And Putin has already said that this was a tragic line of, accident. In other words, that it wasn't an intentional shooting down of the Russian aircraft, and Putin has made a contrast between the shooting down of the Su-24 bomber by the Turks, which he's pointed out was intentional. So I think that this is a point that Putin has made, and I think they will come to some kind of consensus about that. But over and beyond that, the de-escalation will come in this form. The Russians will give a warning to the Israelis, as I said, don't do it again. We're going to beef up our air defenses around Khmeimim even further, and they've already said they will do that. And I am sure that they will be telling the Israelis, look, if you dare carry out this kind of trick again of trying to launch air raids near our base, without giving us proper warning before you do, your aircraft are targets. And I think that the Israelis will take that warning very seriously.
All right. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Thank you very much, guys. We are going to be following this story closely. And like I said, we are going to be doing another video related to this on Putin and Erdogan meeting in Sochi, which is directly related to what has gone on today. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Thank you very much, guys. If you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below and click on the notifications bell to get notifications every time we push out a new video, and visit the Duran shop. Pick up a t-shirt, help support the Duran. And also in the description down below, we have a link to PayPal, and we also have a new Patreon page as well. Please donate, help us to continue to broadcast breaking news like this. Alexander Mercouris, thank you very much. Guys, until next time, take care.